She came from the edge of the trees, not with claws bared, but with her head low. Not to hunt, not to run, but to beg. The story begins on the eastern slope of Laurel Ridge, where the Appalachian forest folds in on itself like a secret. Pines stretch tall and silent, their tips brushed with the soft gold of early October. In these woods, stillness isn't peace, it's pause. And that morning, something heavy waited inside the quiet. She arrived with her ribs showing, not from starvation, but from fear and exertion, her breath shallow, her fur stained with leaf mold and something darker. Her name, if anyone had cared to give her one, might have been Luna. She was a bobcat, small by predator standards, but fierce when it mattered. And it mattered now. Behind her, tucked into the low brush like forgotten toys, 2 kittens huddled together. Their bodies trembled not from cold, but from something inside something wrong. The smaller one barely blinked. The other whimpered once, then stopped. Ahead of them stood a bear. A grizzly, not native to these hills, but here nonetheless. Some said a remnant from a failed wildlife relocation decades ago. Others thought he'd wandered from the west, carried by time, not purpose. Most never saw him. Rangers called him Harlan. Locals didn't speak of him at all. He stood with his back half turned, a patch of lichen still clinging to his shoulder. There was no threat in his posture, no welcome either. Just weight, old weight like something left behind too long. And yet Luna didn't stop. She stepped forward, slow, deliberate, like someone wading into water they don't know the depth of. Her muscles twitched under matted fur, but she didn't crouch. She didn't growl. She didn't even raise her tail. Instead, she bowed her head and dropped to her belly. No animal does this unless it's given up or given in. Luna was neither. She was asking. Not with words, but with something older. A silent plea carved by pain and love and something deeper than instinct. Her kittens wheezed behind her. One let out a broken chirp, more breath than sound. Luna didn't move, didn't flinch. She just looked at Harlan. And he looked back. There are moments in the wild that belong to none of us. Not to science, not to explanation, just to the moment itself. And in that clearing beneath Laurel Ridge, something ancient held its breath. Because predators don't plead, and they don't pardon, but this wasn't war. It was something else. Bobcats are notoriously solitary. They don't run in packs. They don't form alliances. And they certainly don't approach apex predators like bears, especially not grizzlies. Even in the rare stretches of overlapping habitat, bobcats yield territory quietly. They vanish into underbrush before the larger animal ever knows they were there. But this wasn't a question of territory. It was a question of time. And Luna was out of it. One kitten had likely been bitten perhaps by a copperhead, common in the leaf litter this time of year. The other showed signs of internal illness, maybe a reaction to spoiled carrion or water gone bad. Whatever it was, Luna couldn't fix it. And in the wild, when a mother can't fix, she watches. She waits. And eventually, she walks away, and unless there's something stronger than instinct at play, like grief, or memory, or hope. Just down the mountain, a ranger named Elijah had once witnessed a raccoon drag her injured baby to a trailhead where hikers often left food. It lay there until a human found them both and called for help. The mother had run off, but not before pressing her snout into the child's side one last time. Animals don't reason the way we do, but they remember. And somewhere in Luna's life, maybe in the whisper of an old scent or the fading echo of a safe place once passed through, she remembered Harlan. She didn't know his name, but she knew his presence. Maybe she had once seen him lie beside a stream without chasing the fox that passed. Maybe she had caught his scent near a ranger cabin and found no fear in it. Maybe this was her last guess in a world that no longer offered choices. But she came to him, and he stayed. If you've ever watched someone kneel beside a hospital bed, unsure what to say but needing to be there anyway, you know what Luna did. And if you've ever stood unsure of what to offer, only knowing that being still mattered, you know what Harlan did. Sometimes mercy isn't in the act. It's in the pause before the act. In the moment, you don't lash out. In the second, you wait, even if you don't know why. What happened in that clearing wasn't loud. It wasn't showy, but it was real. And for those two kittens, it may have been the only thing left between breath and none. The forest is often painted as red in tooth and claw. Brutal, unforgiving, and it can be. But that's only half the story. The rest is quieter. It's the way deer stand over stillborn fawns, not ready to leave. It's the way crows share food with wounded kin. It's the way Luna, with nothing left to lose, chose to kneel instead of flee. There is a kind of soulfulness in the wild that doesn't make it into textbooks, but you can see it if you know how to look. If you've ever believed that kindness can exist without language, this story is for you. And as the sun rose slowly through the canopy, brushing Harlan's massive frame in gold, he took one step forward. Not toward dominance, not toward control, but toward something else entirely. Next, we'll go back in time to the fire, the cabin, and the day Harlan learned what it means to be saved. Because before he became protector, he had to survive being powerless. Let's go there together. Before Harlan stood in that clearing, he had already faced another fire, one that didn't burn trees but memory. Long before the day he met the bobcat, Harlan's world was ash and heat. It was late summer years back when a lightning strike found the dry underbelly of a mountain hollow. The flames that followed were swift-swallowing bramble saplings and every familiar trail. He had been only a cub then, clinging to the scent of his mother. When she ran, she didn't look back. Animals don't make promises, they make choices. And that day she chose the direction of the wind. He chose the opposite. By the time the smoke cleared, the forest had changed its face. Grizzly bears weren't meant to be in the Appalachian woods. Decades earlier, a small relocation project had brought a few from the northern ranges to study adaptation. Most wandered back west or vanished quietly into deep timber. But one stayed a mother with a single cub. That cub was Harlan. A group of rangers, including one named Mason Rivers, found him half buried under scorched pine needles near the edge of a stream. His fur was singed, his left paw raw from running on coals. They carried him to an old ranger cabin, its walls still humming with the scent of smoke and antiseptic. For 3 months, Harlan lived among people. He learned the click of boots on wooden floors, the gentle murmur of human voices that rose and fell like rainfall. He learned what it meant to be touched without pain. And then, one morning, when the frost first glittered on the porch rails, they took him home, back to the wild. The gate of the transport crate opened with a soft metallic sigh. He stepped out, blinking against the light, surrounded by trees that didn't remember him. He didn't look back either. There's a photograph still hanging in the Laurel Ridge Ranger Station, faded now, the edges curled by humidity. It shows a young ranger, Mason, sitting on a porch step. Beside him, half leaning against his leg, is a bear cub no bigger than a retriever. Mason's hand rests gently on the cub's shoulder palm, open. That's Harlan. Rangers said he was oddly calm for a wild animal too observant. He didn't scramble for food or shy away from light. When the door creaked, he watched it, head tilted, eyes steady. There was something human in it, though no one dared say that out loud. In time, he learned to live alone. He grew larger, his coat thickened, his claws curved into the tools of solitude. But some habits never left: the stillness, the way he paused before taking a life, even a fish or hare. Those who glimpsed him described a bear that listened, not for prey, for meaning. And if that sounds impossible, maybe it is. But then again, nature has a way of teaching humility to those who try to define it too quickly. It's a strange thing, isn't it? How rescue changes not only the saved, but the savior. When Mason lifted that bear cub from the ashes, he didn't know he was also lifting a part of himself. A quiet ache he'd carried since losing his wife years earlier. They'd once fostered stray animals together. He'd promised her in a trembling hospital room that he'd keep doing good things, even small ones. He kept that promise in fur and bandages. And Harlan, though he couldn't have known, carried that imprint back into the wilderness, that memory of gentleness that stays in the bones. For some, kindness is an act. For others, it becomes instinct. People sometimes talk about wildness like it's the opposite of love, as if to be untamed means to be unfeeling. But maybe wildness isn't the absence of love. Maybe it's love that never learned to ask for permission. Harlan's life after his release was quiet, measured by the rhythm of seasons and solitude. He roamed from ridge to river, sometimes leaving claw marks on birch trunks, as if to remind the forest, I was here once. Every few winters, rangers caught signs of him, tracks in snow, half-eaten berries, a cave lined with fern leaves. He never approached humans again, but he didn't vanish completely either. He lingered near old boundaries, places where the human scent mixed with pine. Some nights when the wind shifted, Mason swore he heard branches snap near the tree line. Not a threat, not fear, just a presence. Maybe it was the same instinct that would later draw a desperate bobcat mother toward him. Maybe creatures recognize something familiar not by shape, but by silence. You see this in people too. Someone who's been shown compassion once in their life, even briefly, carries that forward like a secret warmth. A nurse holds an old man's hand as he fades, and 20 years later, that man's daughter volunteers at a hospice. A stranger gives you shelter in a storm, and decades on, you stop for someone's broken-down car without knowing why. Goodness doesn't echo loudly. It drifts quiet as pollen until it lands somewhere new. That's what Harlan carried, a quiet echo. And the day Luna bowed before him, that echo answered. Back at the clearing hours after that first silent meeting, Harlan moved closer, not to dominate, but to see. He lowered his head the way a bear does when curious, but cautious. The cubs smelled of milk and sickness. The air around them trembled with Luna's fear. Something inside Harlan, something from long ago, stirred. He could still feel the hands that once lifted him from the fire, the warmth that didn't demand anything in return. He stepped between the bobcat family and the forest's darker edge. He didn't roar, didn't charge. He just stood, the same way Mason once stood beside him, keeping watch while the cabin slept. There's a moment in every life when you realize strength doesn't always look like survival. Sometimes it looks like restraint. When you've been hurt, and you choose not to hurt. When you could take, and you choose to protect instead. That's the shift that happened inside Harlan that day. Not a miracle, not magic. Just a memory that turned into mercy. And maybe that's the quiet truth behind every story of love in the wild. The best instincts aren't always the loudest. Biologists have documented cases of altruistic behavior among large mammals, moments when instinct pauses long enough for empathy to slip in. Elephants rescue antelopes caught in mud traps. Orcas carry the bodies of their calves for days, mourning in ways eerily familiar. These are glimpses into something scientists still debate, but hearts already understand. When Harlan faced Luna, he wasn't breaking the laws of nature. He was revealing a lesser-known one, that compassion too has evolutionary value. Because empathy sustains life in ways competition can't. That night, fog slid down from the ridges, weaving through trees like breath. The forest turned silver under moonlight. A whippoorwill called once, then fell quiet. Luna curled her body around her kittens. Harlan remained nearby, close enough to guard, far enough to respect. Rain began to fall soft and cleansing. In that hush, their stories overlapped, the cub who'd been saved and the mother praying to save hers. If you've ever stayed beside someone through a sleepless night, not knowing what to say, only that leaving felt wrong, you've known what Harlan knew. And if you've ever trusted a presence, you didn't understand the hand on your shoulder. The stranger who waited, you've known what Luna felt. These are small, ordinary mercies, but they're what keep the world intact. If this part of the story found a soft corner in you, stay with it. There's more to come, because mercy isn't a single act. It's a rhythm, a choice made again and again. As dawn crept over the ridge, mist curling through the pines, something unspoken began to grow between them. Not friendship, not fear, just a fragile understanding. Next, we'll listen closer to the rustle of leaves, the quiet signals only wild creatures know, in the language that doesn't need words. Because sometimes the most powerful things ever said are silent. They never spoke, not in growls, not in howls, not in roars, but they understood each other more clearly than most ever do. In the first soft light of morning, the clearing beneath Laurel Ridge looked like any other patch of wild land. Leaves stirred gently in the breeze, dew clung to the moss, and the distant cry of a hawk echoed through the canopy. But something had changed. The air held a kind of stillness that doesn't come from quiet. Alone, it came from recognition, not in words, not in logic, but in presence. Something had passed between the bobcat and the bear that night. And though neither creature would name it, it had weight. Luna remained curled around her kittens. Their breathing was uneven but present. Life still flickered in them, stubborn as the light pushing through the trees. She had not slept, not really. Her ears twitched at every snap of a twig, but her body did not tremble as it had the day before. She was no longer alone. Harlan hadn't moved far. He stood a little ways off, half sitting on his haunches, eyes half closed, ears alert. His breath was slow, deliberate, calm. In the language of wild things, this was as close to a promise as it gets. Animals don't speak the way we do, but that doesn't mean they don't communicate. They speak in posture, in breath, in distance, in the way they move or choose not to. A curled tail is not the same as a lifted one. A turned back is not absence. It's permission. Researchers call it interspecies signaling. In the forest, it's just survival. But on rare occasions, very rare, these signals become something else, something closer to trust. Luna hadn't marked Harlan as friend. That would have been too much. But she no longer saw him as predator. And in the slow movements of his massive frame, the gentleness of his steps, she had heard something. A message not shouted but lived. I am not here to harm you. That morning, as the sun crept higher, Luna rose slightly to nudge her weakest kitten. Its eyes fluttered open, unfocused, but no longer glassy. It let out a faint sound, more vibration than voice. And then something unexpected happened. Harlan responded. He didn't growl or grunt. He lowered his head toward the cub, exhaled softly through his nose, and let that breath reach the small body. Luna stiffened, ready to defend, but the cub simply blinked. For nearly a minute, the bear and the kitten held space together, one enormous, old and scarred, the other small, sick and fragile. The forest said nothing, but the moment spoke volumes. We often think love must be loud. That protection means action. That connection needs proof. But what if the deepest connections are made without sound? What if it's in the way we sit quietly beside someone in pain, or how we fold a blanket over their shoulders without asking, or how we hold eye contact just long enough to say, I see you, without saying anything at all? Luna and Harlan had no common language, no shared ancestry, nothing in nature that said this should be happening. And yet it was. In that small exchange, breath for breath, they became something unexpected, not enemies, not allies. Witnesses. Each seeing the other fully, perhaps for the first time. Science often asks how and why, but the wild sometimes asks us simply to notice. Interspecies empathy has been observed in moments that defy explanation. A horse standing beside a grieving dog. A chimpanzee stroking the feathers of a dying bird. A fox nudging a hedgehog out of the road. It's tempting to call these anomalies, to place them outside the realm of natural order, but maybe they're not exceptions at all. Maybe they're reminders that the capacity for kindness exists far deeper than words. That emotion doesn't belong to humans alone, and that sometimes mercy is simply about choosing to stay close. If you've ever felt seen in silence or comforted by presence alone, this part of the story was meant for you. Animals rely on more than sight or sound. They read energy. The slowing of breath, the tilt of a head, the way shoulders relax or tighten. These signals, invisible to most of us, form the basis of survival. But in this case, they also built connection. When Harlan paused rather than pounced, Luna registered not just his presence, but his intention. That shift, small, almost imperceptible, meant everything. As the stronger cub stirred, Harlan sat back, letting the bobcat do what only she could: groom, warm, and offer the familiar rhythm of a mother's heartbeat. But the bear remained near, guarding without hovering. A kind of protection that didn't demand recognition. Even the forest seemed to respond quieter birdsong, no, new threats, a hush that felt intentional, like nature itself was holding its breath. There's a story from Oregon 2 decades ago of a woman who lost her voice after trauma. She lived alone for years on the edge of a reserve. She said the only time she felt understood was when a red fox came daily to her porch. They never touched, never played, just sat together. She later wrote, "It's the only friendship I never had to explain." That kind of connection, unspoken, unforced, is rare, but unforgettable. And in their own way, that's what Luna and Harlan shared. The sun filtered through the leaves like warm lace, casting gentle patterns across fur and ground. Luna's ears flicked once toward a squirrel's chatter. Harlan's head followed, not because he was hungry, but because he was listening, the same way she was. Two creatures, once strangers, now watching the world together. Not in fear, but in watchfulness. There's a reason we watch our pets when they sit by the window, eyes fixed on something we can't see. It's because we know on some level they feel what we miss. Maybe that's what makes us return to stories like this. Not for the facts, but for the feeling. The hope that somewhere, even in the untamed wild, a mother and a guardian can meet not in battle, but in bond. As dusk neared, a light breeze passed through the clearing. Luna closed her eyes briefly, just long enough to rest. And Harlan, hulking, worn, silent, stood his watch. Not because it was expected, but because he chose to. But the forest doesn't pause for long. That night, the air would change. The scent of threat would return, and the fragile peace they'd built would be tested by teeth, by hunger, and by the shadows that move without sound. Because compassion isn't proven in stillness alone. It's tested when everything is at stake. And as the wind shifted through Laurel Ridge, the wolves came. What we defend says more about who we are than what we fear. The night didn't roar. It crept. And when it reached the clearing, it came with eyes, not teeth, at least not at first. Twilight fell over Laurel Ridge like a soft blanket soaked in worry. The last of the sunlight filtered through skeletal branches, casting long, quiet shadows across the clearing. The kind of shadows that carried stories. The kind that moved when nothing else did. Luna lay curled around her 2 kittens. One was breathing easier now, the other still fighting. Their tiny ribs rose and fell beneath her chest in staggered rhythm like uneven drum beats in the dark. Harlan remained nearby, his great frame tucked against a patch of moss and stone. He didn't sleep. He never truly did when he guarded. His eyes were half-lidded, but his ears tracked every whisper in the forest. And it was in that stillness just before the first howl that something in him stirred. Wolves are no strangers to these woods. Gray-coated, lean-bodied, driven by hunger, sharpened by the early cold. They don't hunt for malice. They hunt because winter demands it, and when they travel as a pack, they don't announce their arrival with bravado. Not at first. They arrive like memory, scattered, subtle, familiar. One at a time. A paw on wet leaves. A rustle that stops before you turn. A breath that you almost mistake for wind. But Harlan knew. He knew the sound of approaching purpose. He rose slowly without threat, just readiness. And that was when the first howl came. Not from deep in the forest, but close. Too close. Mason Rivers, the ranger, would later say it sounded like a whistle cracked in half, sharp, unnatural. He was camped just a few ridges away, sipping coffee from a tin mug when he heard it. He knew the call. It was a scouting howl. A young wolf marking territory, not for dominance, but for opportunity. And something in Mason's gut turned cold. Because that wasn't just a call for food. It was a signal, a permission. Back in the clearing, Luna stiffened. She lifted her head and scanned the tree line, her breath caught. Then the second sound came, not a howl, but a low crunch. Just beyond the ferns, the forest held its breath. And then they stepped out to 2 wolves, first sleek and silent, not lunging, just observing. They had smelled it, the sickness, the softness, the momentary weakness that makes wild things seem like prey. There's a moment every parent knows, the exact second when the world tilts and the thing you feared becomes real. Not imagined, not someday, But now, Luna couldn't run. Not with her cubs like this, and even if she could, she wouldn't. She lowered her head toward her smallest kitten, brushed her nose against his flank. She didn't cry, didn't growl. She simply braced. And Harlan, he didn't wait for permission. He stepped forward. People often think of protection as something loud, a barrier, a fence, a fight. But sometimes protection is just presence made visible. A figure that does not move away. Harlan did not charge. He did not roar, not yet. He placed himself between the bobcat and the wolves, broad shoulders silhouetted against the fading light. The wolves paused, because even predators know when they've met something immovable. One younger wolf, a male lean and cocky with youth, crept forward, ears pinned, eyes trained on the cubs. And then without warning, Harlan let loose a sound that split the night in two. Not rage, not even warning. It was claim. It's not unlike the stories told by those who've lived through war or chaos. People who say they remember most, not the gunfire, but the one person who stood beside them without flinching. A nurse who refused to leave. A friend who blocked the door with their body. A stranger who met their eyes and said, "I'm here." It's not about overpowering danger. It's about facing it so someone else doesn't have to. That's what Harlan did. There's something deeply familiar in his choice to stand between harm and the helpless. Like a grandparent quietly absorbing hardship so the next generation doesn't have to. They don't boast, they just do. Harlan's decision wasn't calculated. It was remembered, because once someone had stood for him too. And now he returned the gift. The forest lit with motion. The younger wolf lunged just once and was met midair by a swipe from Harlan's paw, fast and final. The blow wasn't fatal, but it was clear. There would be no second try. The pack retreated briefly, circling, thinking. Luna growled, now a low rasping sound that came from somewhere deep, somewhere primal, but her legs buckled beneath her. She couldn't rise. Harlan turned, glanced back once, and then he chose. He charged. What followed was not clean. There were snarls and snapped branches and the shiver of trees as bodies collided beneath them. A wolf bit into Harlan's flank. Another caught his shoulder, but he did not fall. His roar shook the night like thunder. By the time it ended, the wolves were gone, vanished into mist and memory. Denied not, destroyed, Harlan limped back to the clearing, his breath ragged, his fur streaked with blood. He didn't look at Luna. He didn't need to. He lay down just beside her, not touching, but near. The cubs stirred. The smallest one whimpered once, then curled into its sibling. Luna closed her eyes. A sound somewhere between breath and gratitude escaped her throat. And for the first time since twilight, the forest felt still again. There's something sacred about the ones who run toward the danger, not to prove anything, not to earn praise, but because something inside them can't not. That's Harlan, and perhaps that's the quiet thread that connects us all. Humans, animals, anyone who's ever stepped between the ones they love and the shadows rising in the trees. Not heroes, just hearts that know where they're needed. If you've ever stood guard for someone who couldn't stand for themselves. If you've ever faced down a fear because love was louder, then this part of the story is yours. But strength, even when chosen with love, comes at a cost. As the rain began to fall gently across the clearing, it washed more than blood. It washed the question, could he keep standing? Next we follow what Harlan did when pain came not as threat, but as wound. Because compassion doesn't end with courage. It continues with care. When you can't heal, but you can still help, what do you give? He could have rested. He could have turned inward, focused on his wounds. Instead, he left the clearing quietly and returned carrying hope between his teeth. The storm came just before dawn. Not the kind that snaps branches or floods trails, but the softer kind, the one that taps gently on bark and leaves the forest smelling like pine and earth. It was a rain meant for rest, for healing. But healing wasn't simple that morning. Harlan was bleeding. The fight with the wolves had cost him more than energy. His shoulder was torn, his flank raw. The ground where he'd laid showed the rust-colored imprint of effort. And yet, when the rain came, he didn't lie still. Instead, he stood slowly, shaking deliberate, and walked out of the clearing. Most animals, when injured, retreat. Instinct tells them to hide, conserve energy, reduce risk. Especially predators. A wounded bear becomes a target for scavengers, a danger to himself. But Harlan didn't leave to escape. He left with purpose. He moved with intention, nose, low breath, measured as he headed toward a small stretch of ridge he had known for years. A quiet slope where roots clung close to the surface, where certain herbs grew even through frost. Among the tangles of brush and damp stone, he found what he was looking for. A cluster of thick-stemmed, fragrant roots. Golden seal. Known to the locals, humans and otherwise, as healer's root. A ranger once found a black bear near the Virginia border chewing golden seal after a long winter. The bear had a gash across its paw, likely from a wire trap. No one had treated it. Yet weeks later, when spotted again, the wound was closed. Healing. It wasn't random. Animals like bears, moose, even some birds have been observed self-medicating, seeking out plants with antimicrobial or anti-inflammatory properties. Scientists call it zoopharmacognosy, a long name for a simple truth. Sometimes the wild knows how to heal itself, but what Harlan did next was something else. He didn't eat the root, he carried it back. There's something quietly devastating about watching someone in pain still choose to help someone else, not because they're strong, but because they remember what it felt like to be helpless. That's what makes Harlan's return so powerful. He could have rested, could have laid down beside the bobcat family and let the hours pass. Instead, he returned, limping with the root held gently between his jaws as if it were made of glass. He dropped it beside Luna's weakest cub, then stepped back. He didn't explain. He couldn't. But the gesture was unmistakable. This helped me. Maybe it can help you. There's a myth that healing is something loud, full of breakthroughs and epiphanies. But often it's quiet. It's the friend who shows up with soup, the neighbor who shovels your walk without asking, the dog who curls beside your bed when the world feels too heavy. It's a root, left near a cub. In silence, healing doesn't always cure. Sometimes it simply soothes. And in that moment, Harlan wasn't a predator. He wasn't even a protector. He was a giver. Bears possess one of the most advanced olfactory systems in the animal kingdom, able to detect smells from miles away, even through layers of soil. But scent for them isn't just about the food. It's about memory. That root wasn't just a plant. It was a moment Harlan had lived through, a time when he'd once found comfort in the same bitter taste. Maybe it didn't erase the pain, but it reminded his body that healing was possible. Now he was passing that memory on. In a remote part of Kentucky, a woman once raised 2 orphaned raccoons after a flood. One fell ill during its first winter. With little access to vet care, she fed it crushed yarrow, a plant her grandmother used for fevers. The raccoon survived. Years later, another wild raccoon brought her own sick baby to that same porch. They don't speak, but they remember. Animals remember safety, the places, the people, the scents where kindness once lived. That's what Luna saw in Harlan. Not understanding, but something older, familiar. Luna didn't move when Harlan returned, her body curved protectively around the cubs, her breath shallow but steady. She saw the root, sniffed it. Did she know what it was? We'll never know. But she didn't resist when Harlan stepped closer again, only to settle beside them, wounded and weary. His chest rising and falling in time with the rhythm of the rain. Sometimes we can't fix things. The wound stays open, the fever doesn't break. The world keeps turning before the ones we love are ready to rise. But even when we can't heal, we can stay. We can offer what helped us. We can leave something behind that whispers you're not alone. That's mercy. Not the grand, sweeping kind, the gentle kind. If you've ever given something small time space, a quiet gesture, because you remembered how much it mattered when you were hurting, you've lived this moment too. The rain eased by mid-morning, leaving the clearing glazed with silver light. The cubs were quiet. Luna slept lightly, twitching at every sound. And Harlan, wounded, bleeding, and unyielding, kept his watch. Not because he had to, but because he chose to. Again. But not every story is ours to finish. Just beyond the ridge, Mason Rivers had been tracking the strange trail prints that didn't belong together. A bobcat, a bear, too close, too aligned. And what he found would test every rule he'd ever followed. Because the next witness to this story would not come on 4 legs. He would come with questions, and a heart already changed by what he hadn't yet seen. Some stories don't need to be explained, just honored. He followed tracks, expecting trouble. What he found was a silence that asked not to be broken. Mason Rivers had walked these woods for more than 20 years. He'd learned to read the language of prints in mud-broken ferns, the curve of a claw mark on bark. And he knew down to bone when something didn't belong. That morning, what led him deeper into Laurel Ridge wasn't a call from dispatch or a complaint from hikers. It was a feeling, a tug. There were reports of strange movement through the valley, paw prints too close together, signs of pacing, not predation, not escape. He followed the trail the way you follow a memory, unsure what it would reveal, only that it mattered. As a wildlife ranger, Mason had seen many things. Lone coyotes scavenging in daylight, a deer who refused to leave her fallen fawn, a hawk that circled the same burned stump for days after her nest was gone. Nature didn't always follow the rules, but even in its chaos, it had patterns. What he was tracking that day didn't make sense. He'd found bobcat tracks, small, frantic, doubled back over themselves, then just feet away, impressions from a much larger animal. Deep, broad, unmistakable. A grizzly. Except there shouldn't be one here. Not in this part of Appalachia. And definitely not alongside a bobcat. Mason moved slow breath, held through a veil of mist that curled low to the ground. When he finally reached the clearing, it took him a full minute before he understood what he was looking at. 30 yards ahead, a bear slumped but awake. Just beside him, a bobcat curled protectively around 2 kittens. No cages, no barriers, no panic. And the air. The air was different here. Not like other wild encounters where tension hangs like a wire, ready to snap. This clearing was hushed, weighted, sacred in its own way. So Mason did what he hadn't done in years. He knelt. Sometimes the world gives us moments that refuse explanation. Moments that ask us not to act, but to witness. Not to solve, but to hold. Standing there watching this scene unfold, 3 wounded lives choosing proximity instead of fear. Mason felt something shift in him. It wasn't awe. It was something quieter. Recognition. He thought of the long nights after his wife passed, sitting at the edge of the bed, hands empty, no words. Just the company of her dog Sadie, who never left his side. Who never asked anything, only stayed. This was that same kind of presence. The kind that doesn't need answers. Only a heartbeat. Beside yours. We talk often about conservation in terms of protection boundaries, surveillance prevention. But maybe there's another layer to it, observation with reverence. To watch without interfering. To allow without assumption. To let the wild be wild, even when it looks unfamiliar. Mason had spent most of his life enforcing order. Fences, reports, protocols. But standing there with mist rising and 3 creatures bound together by something softer than instinct, he understood. Some stories don't need fixing. They just need space to be. In recent years, wildlife agencies have begun exploring more passive management strategies, choosing to study instead of immediately contain, allowing animals the autonomy to resolve certain conflicts naturally. The scene, a bear, refusing to attack a bobcat, choosing to trust a ranger, choosing to pause, embodied that shift. He didn't call for backup. He didn't load the tranquilizer dart. He simply whispered into his radio, "I've found something. You're not going to believe it. But I'm not interrupting, not yet." And for the next 3 hours, he stayed. Still, present, letting the clearing speak first. A decade earlier, a young intern at a wildlife sanctuary in Montana wrote a short essay about the moment a lynx and an injured owl shared shelter during a blizzard. She ended it with, "They didn't fix each other. They just survived." Near. That quote had lived in Mason's notebook for years. Now it came alive in front of him. These animals weren't allies by species. They weren't playing out a fairy tale. They were just choosing not to run, not to harm, choosing to remain. Rain began to fall again, gentle, rhythmic, steady. Mason moved slowly, laying a clean bowl of water a few yards away, then retreating behind a nearby tree. He watched as the bear, bruised and bleeding, sniffed it first, then nudged it gently toward the kittens. The lioness, Luna, licked her paw, touched the side of her cub's head, then guided it toward the water. No words, no drama, just grace. And Mason, he wept, not loudly, not from sadness, but from the kind of ache that comes when something buried starts to breathe again. Somewhere along the way, Mason had stopped believing nature could surprise him. But there, in a hidden clearing, where the rules didn't apply, and no one demanded explanation, he felt a truth rise that the forest still held things we don't understand. That love across species, across scars, wasn't only possible. It was happening. And that maybe the world wasn't done teaching us yet. If you've ever chosen stillness over reaction, if you've ever witnessed something too beautiful to interrupt, then you've already done what Mason did. You honored the moment. Before he left, Mason took a small notebook from his coat pocket. On a clean page, he wrote one word: mercy. Not for the animals, not for the report, for himself, as a reminder that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is not pull the trigger, but even the most sacred moments must change, and the wild in all its wisdom knows when it's time to move. The next morning, something shifted. Luna stood. Her cubs rose, shaky but breathing, and without a sound they began to walk. Not away from Harlan, but toward the tree line, and what came next was not a goodbye. It was a choice. Some departures aren't endings, they're offerings. They didn't look back, not because they didn't care, but because they didn't need to. The next morning came slow, wrapped in fog. The forest felt different, like something had softened overnight. No wolves, no sounds of warning, only the hush of damp leaves under paw and claw. In the clearing, Luna stood. It had been days since she'd tried to rise without stumbling, but now her legs held steady. The kittens stirred at her side, blinking, sniffing the air, stronger than they'd been since the moment she brought them here. And across the glade, just beyond a drift of ferns, Harlan lifted his head. No sound passed between them, just the quiet tension of a moment neither of them had prepared for. But somehow, new was coming. Goodbyes in the wild don't come with ceremony. There are no hugs, no parting words. Often there's not even eye contact. Departure is a gesture, a movement, and if you're paying attention, you'll know when it's begun. Luna didn't rush. She nosed the smaller cub, gently encouraging it forward. The larger one followed close behind, still limping slightly but alert. Together, they stepped out of the familiar ring of moss and pine needles where they'd been sheltered for days. Harlan didn't move to stop them. He didn't follow. He watched. As the bobcats approached the edge of the clearing, they paused at a natural split in the trail, a narrow fork between two paths shaded by twin sycamores. It was subtle the way Luna lingered, the way she glanced once slowly back toward Harlan, and then in a gesture so quiet it might have gone unnoticed, she stepped toward him. Not all the way, just close enough. She touched her nose to the earth, not in submission, but in something gentler. Then, without hesitation, she turned and led her young into the trees. There are goodbyes we don't say out loud, because the saying would make them harder. So we let the moment speak for itself. A mother letting her child board a train. A friend waving from a porch they used to share. The soft closing of a door when everything that needed to be said has already been felt. Luna's departure was that kind of goodbye. No drama, no distance, just direction. She walked not from something, but toward something, a future, a chance, a quieter kind of hope. So often we measure relationships by how long they last. But some of the most meaningful connections don't last forever. They come into our lives like weather, unexpected, necessary passing. And if we're lucky, they leave behind something we can't quite name, but always carry. What passed between Luna and Harlan wasn't ownership or dependency. It was presence, chosen, offered, released. And that's a kind of love too. What Harlan did next, he stayed. Long after the bobcats had vanished into the pines, long after Mason lowered his binoculars and turned away, Harlan remained in the clearing. Not pacing, not searching, just resting. Because sometimes the goodbye isn't for the one who leaves. It's for the one who stays behind. He lay down in the same spot Luna had sheltered her kittens, his massive frame curling slowly, as if to cradle what was no longer there. And in that stillness, he breathed not in sadness, but in fullness. A chapter closed, a purpose fulfilled. In a nature reserve in New Mexico, a rehabilitated wolf once released back into the wild was observed returning to the fence line of her enclosure weeks later. Not to be captured, but simply to stand there. Researchers noted it wasn't disorientation. She seemed calm, aware. She stayed for several hours, then walked away. They called it the quiet return. Moments like these remind us animals remember the places that held them. They revisit not out of longing, but recognition. They say, I was here once, and something here mattered. That's what Harlan did. In the days that followed, the clearing began to change. The flattened grass rose again. The scent of sickness faded from the moss. Rain came and washed away the prints, little ones first, then the rest. But if you looked closely, you could still see the path Luna had taken, worn just slightly more than the others, marked by choice, not by force. The path she made when she turned toward the trees with everything she loved, still fragile beneath her, and still chose to move forward. It takes strength to stay, but it takes just as much to leave knowing the bond is not broken by distance. For those of us who have said quiet goodbyes to parents, to pets, to seasons of life that shaped us, this moment feels familiar. You don't always need to hold on. Sometimes you just need to remember. If you've ever let something go with tenderness instead of fear, if you've trusted that love doesn't end where presence does, then this goodbye belongs to you too. As dusk fell over Laurel Ridge once more, the wind moved gently through the branches above the empty clearing. No cubs, no growls, just pine needles whispering against each other. And Harlan still there, eyes closed, his breathing slow and certain. A monument not of strength, but of mercy remembered. And though the forest turned the page, the story didn't end. Because what began in that clearing, a plea, a protection, a parting, continued in ways no one could have imagined. In the lives it touched. In the child who spoke his first word, in the ranger who traded his rifle for storytelling, and in a sanctuary that would never be the same again. Because love once seen does not leave quietly, where mercy lingers even after the footsteps fade. The forest forgets nothing, and some stories, even when whispered, grow into something that stays, long after the paw prints had faded and the moss had risen to cover what once pressed it flat. The clearing remained. Not as a monument, there was no plaque, no trail marker, but as something deeper. A place where something real had happened. A place where mercy had taken root. They called it the quiet place at first. Later it became known simply as enough, because that's what it had been. Not perfect, not easy, just enough. Enough warmth, enough shelter, enough presence. For Luna, for her kittens, for Harlan. And in time for others too. The sanctuary team arrived quietly a few days after Mason's call. No helicopters, no cages, just a mobile vet unit and a deep understanding of what not to do. They followed one rule: do not break the bond. From a safe distance they observed, dropped food, left clean water, watched as Harlan limped across the glade not to dominate, but to rest beside the bobcat as if tethered to her by something invisible. The cubs grew stronger. Luna's coat thickened again. And when the time came, she chose to leave not under force, but by instinct, just as she had arrived, just as she always would. But the story didn't walk away with her. It stayed. In the soil, in the trees, in the way people looked at the clearing, then at each other, and realized something they hadn't before. A few months later, a boy named Jonah visited the sanctuary. 7 years old, quiet, sweet, non-verbal since birth. His parents had tried everything, speech therapy, social groups, devices, but he never spoke. Not a single word. They didn't expect anything different that day, just a walk through the woods, fresh air. Then they reached the edge of the old clearing. Jonah stopped. There, where the light filtered through like honey and the breeze carried no sound at all. He sat cross-legged and stared toward the middle of the space at nothing in particular. He didn't blink much. He didn't move. Until he did. He reached out a small hand, touched the trunk of a fallen tree beside him and whispered, "Bear." Just once. Soft as breath. Strong as stone. His parents cried. Mason, who had returned as a guide that day, said nothing. He only nodded. Something had been left in that forest, and something had been found. We go through life thinking certain things can't happen, that the wild will never choose compassion, that a predator can't become a protector, that a child may never speak, that we are who we've always been. And then something shifts. A grizzly chooses not to strike, a bobcat chooses to trust. A ranger lays down his rifle. A child speaks. None of it demanded understanding, only presence, only care, only the simple sacred act of staying. Because in the end, healing doesn't arrive in thunder. It comes in footsteps, in watching, in the sound of rain on fur, in kindness offered quietly with no expectation. That is the heartbeat of the wild, and sometimes the heartbeat of us. It's easy to believe we're separate from the world beyond our walls. That nature is something over there, untouchable, chaotic, unfamiliar. But maybe it's more familiar than we think. Maybe mercy isn't a human invention. Maybe love isn't ours to patent. Maybe, just maybe, the forest knows what we've forgotten, that what survives isn't the strongest. It's the most willing to choose kindness, even when no one is watching. This wasn't a fairy tale. It wasn't a parable. It was real. A bobcat, wounded and wild, placed her faith in something she should have feared. A grizzly, wounded and wild, remembered the shape of gentleness and chose to give it back. And somewhere in between, the rest of us got to witness what happens when nature does what we rarely do. Offer without asking. Guard without gain. Leave and still love. Now visitors still come to the edge of the clearing. They walk slowly. Some speak softly. Others say nothing at all. There's no sign telling them what happened here. No voiceover, no tour. Just a small wooden post etched with a single word, "Here." And above it carved gently into a curved slab of stone where the wild chose kindness. At sunrise, the light catches that stone just right, like it's glowing from within. At dusk, it disappears entirely, swallowed by the soft arms of pine shadows. And through it all, the clearing remains untouched. Not because it's protected, because it's respected. So now, dear listener, I ask you, what will you carry from this story? Will you remember Harlan not for his strength, but for the way he paused? Will you think of Luna not as a wildcat, but as a mother who knew when to ask for help? Will you see yourself in the ranger who once chose silence over certainty? Will you look at the world a little softer now, believing there's more to nature and maybe to yourself than you were taught? If this story stirred something in you, let it stay. Let it guide the way you walk through your days. And if it brought you comfort, hope, or wonder, please consider subscribing, liking this video, and sharing it with someone who needs to believe again. And if you'd like to help stories like this happen more often, if you believe in second chances for animals like Luna, and safe places for creatures like Harlan. You can leave a super thanks or donate directly through the link below. Your gift helps rescue, heal, and protect wild animals, so they too can find their version of enough. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring. And until next time, walk gently. The wild is watching.